Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar, Work in Progress, Successfully Navigating the Return to Work. I'm Mike Prokopik, Vice President and Editor-in-Chief at Reworked.co, and it's my pleasure on behalf of everybody at Simpler Media Group, CMSWire, and Reworked to welcome you to our presentation today. A little bit about how this will work. I'll spend a few minutes up here just introducing the topic, the tools for today's webinar, as well as our speaker. We'll have about 35 to 40 minutes of presentation time, and we'll break that up a little bit with some polls and questions for you as well. But we're also reserving some time at the end of the presentation for questions and answers. So please, at any point during this presentation, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A module in the top right of your browser. If you have any problems with that, be sure to let us know. But as you're going through this presentation, be sure to type in your questions there, and we're reserving some time at the end to answer those. A little bit of background here. Some of you may be joining us from the CMSWire brand, and CMSWire was founded in 2003. And our focus really is the digital customer experience, the digital workplace, and information management. Earlier this year, we launched the brand Reworked.co, and Reworked was really developed in response to the rise of the digital workplace and something that has really transformed how work happens in 2020. And so I'm leading the editorial and content operations for Reworked, and I'm excited to bring that to you. If you haven't already signed up to follow Reworked or to get our regular newsletter, be sure to go to reworked.co and sign up now. Really excited to have you be a part of that. I also want to just say a quick word of thanks to our sponsor for today's webinar. So thank you to the folks at Skillsoft who are helping to make this webinar happen. You can check out the offerings they have at skillsoft.com. They, in fact, do have a lot of safety and compliance-based learning solutions built for around this very topic of returning to the office. And then also just want to make a quick note. If you are joining us today, be sure to stay until the end of the live Q&A at the end of the session, where we'll, two lucky attendees who stay will have the opportunity to win one of two $50 Amazon gift cards. And we'll email you if you are one of those winners post-webinar. All right, now on to today's topic for the webinar and our speaker. This idea of return to the office has really been a work in progress, and I had the pleasure to interview Connie Moore, who is Vice President and Principal Analyst at Deep Analysis, for a story I did on return to office planning that was published on Reworked a little bit earlier this month. And it's no surprise that plans are all over the place. There are some companies that have already returned to the office. There are some that have pushed it off into 2021 and beyond, and some even have made the office permanently optional for many employees. So it's really a time that's in a lot of flux. But I think one thing that stood out to me as I interviewed Connie was this quote when she said, quote, "I just think going into this with a lot of kindness is important because it's just a time when everyone's totally stressed out and employees are adrift in many instances." And I think that's a great way to sort of approach the challenges of the time we're in as companies are figuring out when we go back to the office, what will that look like, and making sure that employees are involved, but also that the companies are ensuring that they're staying in compliance with many of the safety regulations as well as the government regulations that may be in place around their return to office planning. So I'm really excited for Connie to share this presentation. I think she's got a lot of insight to add. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Connie.
Well, thank you, Mike. I appreciate this. And we're going to be talking about how coronavirus has impacted everyone. We're all in it together. It has impacted different industries different ways. I want to give a shout out to Mike for that quote, which I had forgotten I said. But personally, I found that there are three things I have to hang on to during this whole pandemic. One is hope, one is patience, and one is kindness. And if I can hang on to those three things, I feel like I can get through it. And I think that's true of other people and of businesses and higher ed at large. So some people have been working from home and will continue to be working from home for some time. They may be in the service industry where they're not engaging with customers or with physical goods. But there are a lot of other industries where they've had to keep working from the very beginning. Obviously, we know about healthcare professionals who've been at the front line, but there are people in the supply chain that keep products coming to us. Grocery stores are operating, pharmacies are operating, pharmaceuticals are operating. So this has been a really big challenge to business executives and technologists as well. How do you manage this rolling need to have workers facing customers at offices physically distanced, or how do you manage a remote workforce as well? And so our agenda today is to look at the business drivers and how a whole new market has emerged for workforce safety, how to manage this whole process. If you're working in a really large company and managing the workforce, it's a very big challenge. I'm going to look at how compliance impacts this, and I'll give you two examples. One, a very large insurance company, and the other, University of South Florida, which has allowed us to publish a case study and reference what they're doing. There's some lessons learned that we've garnered by conversations with early adopters, and how do you get started? So Mike, we want to get some background information about what our attendees today are interested in.
Great. Well, thank you, Connie. And as mentioned, we're going to be looking for your participation at a number of points throughout today's presentation. So here's the first opportunity. We're launching a poll and asking each of you to just give us a little bit of background information about what type of organization are you, and you can check all that apply here. Number one, are you a business that is concerned with workforce safety? Are you a business that's concerned with customer safety? Are you a government agency that's concerned with workforce safety, or a government agency that's concerned with citizen safety? And then finally, are you a higher ed institution where you're really looking at student safety? So we're making that poll live, so please go ahead and take a moment to tell us what your concerns are, what type of organization you are with. And while we're waiting for those results to come in, Connie, I just wanted to say, I think the fact that you're bringing in an education institution is an important point, because in many ways, it seems like education institutions are kind of at the vanguard of how we're figuring this out. Many made the decision to open campuses back up after a long period of really trying to figure it out. And now we're seeing many of them close back up, or really kind of curtail a little bit of their in-person interactions. What's your take on education institutions?
Well, there's a lot of pressure in higher ed to be open because parents expect their kids to have not only an academic experience, but a whole campus life experience as part of growing up. But it's really, they are at the vanguard, and it's really a hot spot. And so the higher ed institutions I've talked with have tried to have a lot of flexibility and adaptability put into their planning process and their deployment process, because they have to roll back and roll forward. It's interesting to see the poll results, and it's not a surprise to me that we have primarily businesses concerned with workforce safety, because that is the thing I'm hearing the most about. I'm very curious about those concerned with customer safety, because I know it's an issue, and I know it's hard to find companies that have been willing to talk about what they're doing to manage the customer safety. It's just something they're holding close to the vest. Government agencies, it's a workforce thing, unless you're like a transit authority or something like that. And then higher ed's represented here. So we've got a good agenda for today's audience. So let's push on to the content. And what I have learned is there are two overriding push-pull kinds of drivers. One is that all these enterprises, whatever industry they're from, want to reopen quickly. And there's pressure to reopen quickly for several reasons. That you're losing revenues by not being open. Your employees may not be getting paid by not being open. Or in the case of higher ed, your students may not be experiencing the full campus life. So speed is paramount. However, there's a caveat. It does you no good to reopen if you're not safe. And so safety and quickness are the push-pulls, right? Let's hold back and withdraw and do this slowly, and let's do this as fast as we can because we need to. Other drivers that are influencing this are plans for business continuity over the long term, compliance we're going to talk about, being able to handle incidents as they occur, things you can't predict, but once you're in them, you're really in hot water. So mitigating risk is another factor. I'll say right now, there will be lawsuits about employees being exposed to higher risk than people would think tolerable. There'll also be lawsuits about customers being exposed to risks that they consider beyond reasonableness. And so as an executive in an organization, your goal is to minimize those risks as much as possible because of exposure. So it's a complicated subject, and it's a situation where you have to move very, very quickly, and no one has the playbook. They're figuring that out together. So, Mike, we have our second poll question.
Great, yeah, thank you. Here's your second chance to let us know about who you are and what you're looking for out of today's session. So we're making this poll live. The question is, when will your organization most likely implement workforce safety software? So your plans around workforce safety software. Are you planning to implement software in the next 3 months? Within 3 months, within 6 months? Have you already implemented that? Are you not sure when, or do you actually have no plans to implement workforce safety software? So go ahead and take a moment, fill that out. And just to, while folks are doing that, Connie, just to reiterate that point you were talking about lawsuits, that is actually one of the sticking points in the U.S. at least around the next round of aid, government aid packages that would be delivered. That some folks are arguing that they want to make businesses exempt from lawsuits related to the coronavirus openings, and there's others who are arguing against that, and that's actually turned into a pretty big sticking point around a government aid package. So definitely an issue that the businesses need to make sure that they're paying attention to.
So we have interesting results in that a percentage of our attendees today have already implemented some workforce safety software. And the reason that's notable is this whole software category is brand new. I mean, this stuff didn't exist in January, so this is new stuff. And then we have those that are falling further behind, but are planning to do something in 6 months. Others aren't sure, and no plans to implement. That means we've got a bunch of learners on the call, and that's great, wanting to learn more about what this is all about. And so hopefully we'll be able to enlighten everyone. So I mentioned the category of software, and I hope you can see the bottom. There are two dimensions that I've segmented the market into. One dimension is how fast can you deploy a particular type of solution. The other dimension is how functional is it? Is it low functionality, or is it what you're really looking for as an executive? So in terms of functionality, there are frameworks and accelerators and templates that are available from a range of companies. I spend most of my time with digital process automation, and all of those vendors have come up with some sort of way of helping their customers get there faster using digital process automation products. And that's true in the content world and the RPA world and so forth. But it's pretty low on functionality. You have to build out quite a bit. And there are also organizations that are creating this functionality on their office tools. And that has fairly low functionality if you compare it with the SaaS applications that have become available on the market. And of course, if you do custom development, either in-house or with an integrator, you're going to get what you're looking for. But it may take quite a bit of time, and it may be pretty expensive. So some examples of the vendors that are in this software space, let's look at the accelerators and frameworks. So Highland Software is an example of really one of the first companies I became aware of that created an accelerator and framework. They literally did it overnight with an engineer and some of his friends working on a weekend. Nintex is another vendor that's been pushing pretty hard in this, but there are many, many more. The companies that are building out on the Office platforms, they're using Microsoft SharePoint and Power. And I'll say something about that. If you are using a lot of email and spreadsheets and e-forms and technology such as that, you may actually be able to manage the workforce, but you're pretty much at risk in terms of compliance for email because this information is private, it's under regulatory control, and email is a very insecure way to handle secure employee privacy health data. So having said that, the in-house and systems integration route, there are integrators that are really targeting this market. PwC is one example. And then there are some out-of-the-box SaaS solutions. Appian is one, Salesforce is another. Pegasystems has a solution as well. And one of the differentiations to look at in this category is it platform independent or does it require the vendor's underlying platform in order to work? So Mike, we've got our third and final poll. So what are organizations looking at in terms of how to approach the software?
Yeah, so the question now for you, the poll hopefully is launched for you live. What type of solution do you primarily use or plan to use when you're looking at return to work and safety? Are you planning to use a SaaS or ready to deploy application, so something kind of off the shelf that's ready to go? Are you looking to build a custom solution, so something in-house? Are you looking for a framework, an accelerator, or a templated approach when you're addressing these issues? Are you planning to build on to existing office productivity tools? And again, a choice is also no plans to implement. So maybe you're in early stages or haven't really gotten around to thinking through very clearly some of what you need to be doing there. So go ahead and fill in your thoughts there. What type of solution do you primarily use or plan to use as you return to work?
So
looks like the answers are coming in there.
Yeah. Are they still coming?
Still coming, but I think you're probably got a pretty good gauge on that now. So go ahead, Connie.
So that's interesting. The in-house custom approach seems to be first and foremost with productivity tools and accelerators the sort of neck and neck. And it's interesting that we don't have people responding to the SaaS and ready to deploy application. That's an interesting result to me. I would have expected more in that category as well. So what we think, this is some research that I published, and I tried to summarize what we think. And I think all of these approaches, whether it's building a solution on top of your office productivity, building solutions on frameworks and templates, or buying something off the shelf, all of these are viable approaches. But I believe that you need an approach, trying to manage health and safety of thousands of individuals with privacy thrown in and regulatory control thrown in, using spreadsheets, Word documents, and email is really nonsensical, especially as you scale up into multinationals that operate in many countries. On the other hand, I think that building a complete in-house solution in impossible timeframes is equally foolhardy, because it may just take too long to build out that functionality. If you do it with a systems integrator who already brings something to the party, I think that that is a viable solution. And I think that if you take those frameworks and templates or tool sets that vendors offer and use that to leapfrog into your custom development solution, that would be ideal. But traditional custom development, I think, takes too long. So there are kind of two major components to this software. And the first is almost undoubtedly a mobile app that employees have or students have that they do self-reporting. So you're looking at things like, have I been exposed to the virus? Do I need testing? Have I had testing? What are my test results? Do I need to go into quarantine? How long do I need to be in quarantine? Who else was exposed? Am I clear to return to work? Am I clear to return to a physical premise? And oh, by the way, how are you protecting this data that I'm giving you? One thing to realize, besides the compliance thing, is that this can be a stigmatizing disease. And so you really, really want to protect this personal health information. The other piece to workforce safety software are management dashboards to keep the people running the organization in full understanding of what's going on with their workforce. And if you think about it in terms of a multinational, you're tracking a workforce that is spread across many countries, spread across many states, spread across many continents. All of those places have different requirements and different compliance requirements, and they all have hotspots popping up at different times. So you need a really powerful dashboard that allows you to do analytics, to do what ifs. What if we reopen these buildings but socially distance them? And what if we shut down these real estate contracts? How does that affect our ability to support phase 2 return to work? So there are exceptions, there are incidents, there's regulatory information that constantly changes. There's certifying your workforce to go back to work. All of this is a very complex thing to manage. HR needs a dashboard for managing the workforce. Legal, business continuity, business risk need to know how exposed is the organization and how does the organization respond to potential problems. There's a third dimension, which is physical security. And so workforce safety software it typically has it's not that big of a market, but you would want to have some sort of device that allows you to certify that individuals can in fact be on the property, to give them access to the facility, possibly access to conference rooms if your conference rooms are open, and access to the vehicle fleets. One other point that I wanted to make on the executive dashboards is the whole facilities cleaning and monitoring that. And you can have breakdowns there too, where employees who've returned to the physical space are exposed to some sort of risk because a cleaning process fell through and didn't happen properly. So the complexity of this is quite high. You tend to look at it in terms of business requirements and technical requirements. So I've mentioned the dashboards of mobile apps. Analytics is very, very important for decision making. The whole being affordable is a big issue because, first of all, organizations haven't budgeted for this kind of software development, so it's an exception. But secondly, because a lot of these organizations are under financial duress and they need to get opening right away, but they don't have a lot of money to spend on the solution set. And I think on the technical side, having something that's adaptable and agile, even one of the packaged solutions, you have to be able to change it and really anticipate future change that you don't know what it's going to be, but you know you will need to make changes. And at that point, you want to look at the vendor track record and how their solutions work and if they are changeable. So I wanted to review a couple of organizations that have done this. One is a large insurance company, over 15,000 employees, operating across many states within the U.S., operating in many countries in Europe, and having a foothold in Asia as well. The CEO was very involved in making sure that the organization moved quickly to get a software solution to manage this. And the CEO had two stipulations. The CEO wanted a mobile application for employees to use and simplicity for the workforce software. And the reason mobile is so important is a lot of these employees that are reporting their health status and exposure status and so forth aren't in an office. They're out. In many instances, they may be out with the customer. I'll give you an example. I had surgery earlier this year, and it's been a very long recovery. I can't begin to tell you how many people have been coming into my house, helping me recover and do therapies and things like that from a number of organizations. We also refinanced our house to take advantage of lower mortgages. So the appraiser has come in. The mortgage was closed at our kitchen table. And so these people aren't near a laptop. They are out with the customer or with other colleagues. And so mobility is important. In this particular instance, the project was driven by a business architecture team that was very experienced in workforce software, but they were taking their leadership from the business resiliency office. So it was IT business architecture people working in sort of a business-driven area. But HR is the major stakeholder in this insurance company when it comes to managing the workforce, being the key executive in charge. You can't do this by yourself. They had to obviously consult with the legal teams, especially the European regulations and privacy regulations. Because this was an insurance company, they had a chief medical officer. If you look at other types of industries, retail or something like that, you might not have a chief medical officer to draw upon. And if that's the case, you need outside expertise to help. In this case, the health professionals and the business resiliency team manage the number of cases, the hot spots, and so forth. Now, this company plans to launch a 3-phase approach, all of it voluntary. And the first phase they're in right now. And when I talked to them a couple months ago, they were unable to say how well the software was meeting their needs because they were right in the middle of starting phase 1. Their phase 1 is an all-volunteer workforce that's going back to physical premises, and they're controlling very much the physical premises that are open. Depending on how phase 1 goes, then they're going to do phase 2, which is once again voluntary but larger scale. And then phase 3, they haven't even really planned that out in that much detail because they're not there. So I would say at this organization, safety is really a paramount concern for them. Their key lesson learned, I think it's an important lesson learned, and I do a lot of work in adaptive change management, and this is really, really best practice. They spoke with one voice and one message. So they didn't want the real estate people canceling leases and drawing down the physical footprint and communicating about that, while the medical team was communicating something else and HR was doing another thing about phased reentry. So from the very beginning, they had this one team with the representation you see here, and it was managed by HR. In other organizations, the COO may manage it, or you may have a business continuity officer who's managing it. But the key is multiple stakeholders, close collaboration across disciplines, and communicating one time, one way with the workforce. And as a change management practitioner, I'll have just one adage I want to share with you. In change management, the adage is always communicate, communicate, communicate. And when you think you've communicated enough and you're so tired of communicate some more. Because this gets back to employee concerns, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, fear, and you want people to be hopeful, and you want people to have knowledge and insight about what's going on. How does it affect me? The second example I have is the University of South Florida, and they are very much back on campus, but they did it with a lot of planning and intention. And I like the quote here because it is a realistic way to look at this. University executives are cautious and not yet ready to declare victory because the COVID situation on campus and elsewhere could change quickly without warning. So Florida's been in the news a lot for different flare-ups. And so not only are they in a campus setting, which a lot of schools have had issues, but they're in a state where there's been a lot of up and down in terms of cases. So what they did is they developed 3 types of courses, and a student can take any of these approaches for their courses. So one is the hybrid flexible model, and it's the blended learning. And so some is in person, but most is online, and the in-person meetings are specified and well understood up front. Then the primarily remote is where you have minimal in-person, but you do have some. So in cases where there might be project teams working together or taking exams, or maybe presentations are an important, in-person presentations are an important part of the subject matter. And then the third option is fully remote, nothing in person, all off-site, online. And they've given that choice to students. Now, the way they develop this is really interesting. First of all, they have a med school. And so the dean of public health was the stakeholder, the senior stakeholder driving this. And they went on spring break and they didn't come back. They just said, stay at home, and staff were sent at home as well. And immediately following this decision to be off campus, within a week, they had all their courses online. And right away, they started planning the workforce software, workforce safety software. So in early June, the IT organization started looking at the solutions, and it was driven by requirements from the Dean of Public Health. And over the summer, they surveyed the student population to see what students wanted in terms of being on campus, being off campus, or the mixture of both. And by early to mid-August, they had configured, tested, and deployed their workforce safety software product. And then the campus reopened. You can see the tight timeframes. Campus reopened in late August with the full schedule, 60% capacity for the dorms, 30% of the courses are on site, and now they're deploying new versions of the software, continuing to test and expand the capability. They selected Appian, the SaaS solution. One reason is that they already had a relationship with Appian. They used Appian's low-code digital process automation product for several years prior to this. And that allowed them to feel like that they knew a lot about the development environment and that they would be able to tailor the software to their own needs. So they saw flexibility and speed. One of the other things they mentioned specifically is it's purpose-built software. Some of the products they looked at were designed for businesses, and the product that they ended up selecting was designed for higher ed, and they liked that. They felt that the user interfaces and applications were student-centric, and that they could integrate the Campus Pass capability that Appian has. They could integrate that with third-party software and with their campus-wide text messaging system. So those are some of the factors that went into their decision-making. But I think you can see they had to move really, really fast in order to open this fall. They didn't have a lot of time for this. I've talking about compliance. Let's take a look at it for a minute. Now, I don't hold myself out to be a compliance expert. There are people who really know this very, very well, and you want to get them involved in whatever you do for managing your workforce, managing your customers, managing your citizens, or managing your students and faculty. The two big regulatory acts that you have to pay attention to, depending on your industry sector, is HIPAA, and FERPA is a similar type of regulation for managing student privacy data. So all of us have gone to the doctor and had to sign off on what seems like a zillion HIPAA forms and stipulate who we can share, what doctors we can share our health data with, if there's maybe an individual, in case of an emergency, can share private health data with. And this is a big, big deal. So you must be compliant with this, or you put yourself at a lot of risk in terms of lawsuits. And the same goes for FERPA. There are four other compliance organizations I want to mention. One is HITRUST, which is a consortium that looks at the exchange of health data from one party to another party. And there are stipulations that are coming from that alliance. There's a similar framework that refers to exchanging health data between the US, the European Union, and Switzerland. The International Standards Organization has guidance and compliance. I found their website to be very helpful in terms of just giving advice. And then GDPR, which we've been looking at for many other reasons, is a factor as well. If you're a US organization and you have operations or customers that you're selling to directly in Europe, then a GDPR applies to you. It doesn't just mean companies based headquartered in Europe. It means if you're doing business in Europe, then this applies to you. But there are a lot more guidelines and regulations and so forth that impact this. And you need to know county regulations, state regulations, country regulations. As you can see, certain government entities that span countries. And I have a friend who's an executive in a large hospital a company, and they said they cannot keep up with the regulations, and they've had to hire 5 people to manage tracking all the regulations that influence them and supplying the data that's being requested. And just think about it. If you're a company that's involved in the transit of goods and you start out in one state and you end up in another state, you're having to pay attention to both those states. And it gets very complicated if you're a large company across the U.S. or across multiple continents. The final thing I wanted to mention is customers, and I started it at the beginning. There are organizations that are looking at this type of software to manage the customer's risk. And they're looking at things like contact tracing, how much is the facility being cleaned for customer usage? Is there enough protection equipment for their workers? How's the air quality? How can they reduce the touch points in like a retail environment or a pharmacy and so forth? I want to say a word about contact tracing. Mask and physical distancing are known ways to reduce spread. A third very, very important thing is contact tracing, where you keep track of who, if you were exposed to the virus, who else have you been in touch with, and where did it come from, and the place where it came from, who else was in contact with them. Now, there are countries in Asia that have managed very quickly the pandemic because they had Bluetooth, enabled mobile devices that would track proximity and who got in within a certain range of another person who might have been infected, and they were able through software to figure out contacts. That has not been an acceptable technology solution in our culture because of concerns about Big Brother and so forth. But contact tracing is happening. And you have a couple of choices. Well, there are more than one. Certain locations, certain states mandate that only the state can do contact tracing. There also are contact tracing software solutions that run in workforce safety software. And to a certain degree, there's contact tracing as functionality in all workforce safety software. But if there's a heavy focus on software to manage contact tracing, that becomes a much more expensive solution, typically around twice the cost of software products that mainly do self-reporting. So there is a difference, and it's something to be mindful of when you're looking at solutions. In terms of advice, reopening as soon as possible is very important, but people are fearful not only of the physical location, they're fearful of things like mass transit. You get into healthcare issues, you get into issues about some workers are upset that they don't have a healthcare requirement and can work full-time or above full-time, whereas other people have a childcare issue and they have to reduce their hours. So there's tension. I have found that a lot of companies are very unaware of their HIPAA exposure. And a lot of organizations are working on the workforce and haven't gotten around to the customer safety issues other than setting protocols for what to do in customer-facing situations. So there are a lot of issues, and they have to be addressed, and all of this needs to be done fairly quickly. So how do you get started? I think you need to find out what your workforce thinks or what do your students think. Get a good sense of what your customers are doing, what your customers expect. Look at how much time you have to put this all together and how can you scale it? How can you modify it? answer that question about contact tracing. Do you want to spend the money on a very automated solution, or do you want self-reporting? Can you go to your existing vendors? What kind of solutions do they have? Or do you need to bring something else in that you don't have experience with the vendor? Very much need to know the compliance requirements. How are your internal resources? A lot of organizations, their IT organization is pretty slammed with all the other things that are going on, and you may not be able to develop this in-house even if you want to. What are the features? How much budget do you have? And what kind of platforms are required to run the solution that you want to deploy? So these are all the issues to take a look at, and how to move forward in getting your workforce safety implemented soon. And with that, we can open up to questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Connie. Appreciate that. We've got some time for questions. So just a reminder to those of you in the audience, be sure to use the Q&A app in the upper right-hand side to pitch your questions in. While that's happening, Connie, I wanted to ask you one thing. You mentioned when we were looking at the poll results early that you were surprised that there weren't as many folks who were using SaaS providers when they're looking at a software solution. I can see the benefits of that approach. Obviously, you're kind of getting an off-the-shelf, so to speak, approach to this. There's not a lot of development, or you can pay some money and you can and be off and running and have something up and running fairly quickly. But what are the drawbacks of going with a SaaS-based approach to software for returning safety and return to work?
I think the drawback may be that your particular industry has some uniqueness to it. I think about the supply chain issues get really complicated very quickly, have a lot of underlying information management issues. So I think that it could be industry driven. It also, I think, in general, may be perceived that a packaged solution won't allow the flexibility and adaptability that companies think they need. And so they feel more secure that they can build it in themselves. There is a functionality that's really important, in my opinion, and it's case management. And it would be possible, for example, to take a digital process automation product and do a custom build on top of that using low-code software and have case management capability. The reason I think case management is so important is you can manage incidents using case, or you can manage service requests using case, and you can use case management for investigations. So that is a really foundational technology, I think, and you can get it in the packaged solutions, or you can build it into your own solution.
All right, thank you. Another question, given that this is a very complex issue, are there frameworks for how you determine who should be at the table when you're having a conversation internally about how you address this? You mentioned a lot of different stakeholders. Is there a framework that you can point to, or guides that you would say this is how you should approach it? And obviously you can modify it based on the type of company you are, your size, your complexity, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think it really does depend on your company. I will say that there are companies that they would not put HR in charge of this. They might put the COO in charge because the COO has much more purview. And then all the people participating would be, answerable to the COO or the CEO. And so I think where I would go is I had that slide in the very beginning that was the business drivers, and it had the various issues. So risk, Some organizations are at much higher risk than other organizations simply because span, how much customers are involved, the nature of the work itself. Like if you're in healthcare, you got a high risk. And so I would look at those drivers that go back to that slide. There's risk mitigation, there's business continuity, there's speed, there's safety, and figure out who owns that, who's responsible for that, and then work your way down. Is it how important, do you even have a chief risk officer? How important is getting this medical input, and do you have a chief medical officer, or do you need to bring that from outside? What kind of role do you want HR to play? Because HR has a very significant role. And I didn't put this in here, but I did reference it, and you and I talked about it when we did research for the article. I think this is a big change management initiative. And I also think in some ways is similar to when you do business transformation, how you have to pull the different stakeholders together and figure out how you're going to do governance for it. So if you don't have a working model, you might go to some digital transformation work that you've done and see what worked and what didn't work, and see how much those lessons learned in your culture, in your industry, can be applied to these project teams.
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely critical point. I think we tend to think of this as this return to work planning as a case of when it's going to be done at a certain point. But in fact, what we're seeing is that we've been doing this for so long that we're entering a new reality for how we're going to be working. So your point about really thinking of it as a digital transformation, as a change management process, is an incredibly valid one, because it's not like you're going to be done with this at a certain point. You're going to be addressing specific issues that may be finished at certain points, but what you're constantly doing is evolving yourself as an organization. And this just happens to be a pivot point or an influencer point of that bigger conversation.
Yes, and there's so much more tension and potential for conflict around this, because we're talking about people's welfare, both their physical welfare as well as their financial welfare. And we're talking about the company's resiliency, the company's ability to be profitable and to not shrink and not go under. So the tension in this is very high. And I think that needs to be, like, that's the elephant on the table. I think you need to know that that's what you're dealing with, and have people on project teams who are experienced in those kind of issues, regardless of the circumstances. They know how to communicate with the workforce. They know how to properly address employee concerns.
Yeah, I want to hone in on that point around employee concerns, because there's been some survey work, and again, we talked about it when I wrote that article that you served as a source for. There's been some surveys saying that employers aren't necessarily asking their workforce what their feeling is about plans. I mean, it's not the majority, but there is some concern that folks aren't asking and that employees aren't feeling heard. You were a little bit skeptical about the employee voice being within there. I think you weren't saying that it shouldn't be there, but it shouldn't be the primary driver. Can you maybe explain a little bit about your thinking of the role of the employee voice in these conversations?
As in any business decision about anything, whether it's mergers and acquisitions or whatever, the business's concern is growth, revenue, profit, and results. And if they're a public company, even more pressure. And that's going to drive the thinking. But I do think the workforce is vitally important. Right now, they don't have leverage, right? I mean, just employees are grateful they have jobs, and are grateful they're able to work full time, and are grateful if they can work from home, that they're safe and more secure. So employees don't have a lot of leverage in that they can't easily just pick up and go work somewhere else. So it's easy for the employees to get marginalized, but I think that would be a horrible mistake because there is some research about worker satisfaction during the pandemic being connected to customer satisfaction during the pandemic. So if you have grumpy workers interfacing with a customer, external customer, that's going to hurt you. So I do believe that the workforce is vitally important, needs to be surveyed, needs to be communicated with, needs to feel like they've had input into, but I think it's very easy for executives to say, we're doing X because we got to hit revenue targets.
Yeah. And the one that I think probably gets overlooked, to the segment of the workforce that I think may get overlooked quite a bit, is middle managers, who are kind of at the sticky point of all this, where they've got folks who are reporting into them who they have to, be responsive to and make sure that they're responding to the needs. But then they also themselves are charged with implementing the top-down process, or whatever the organizational process is. And their concerns may get lost in that shuffle.
I'm so glad you said that, because I think two things. One is, when I've been talking to companies about how are they addressing workforce safety, it's all about the executives that need the dashboards, that are making the hard decisions about risk and compliance and continuity and workforce and so forth. And I say, well, what about the line of business people, that are having to make that supply chain work? Oh, no. They just, they're off to the side. We got to have these, stakeholders involved. And so if the line of business person is kind of put to the side, the middle manager is just caught. And the middle manager is so important in that communicate. So you might have this single voice coming from this single source in the company, and that is fantastic. But somebody's got to deal with the questions that come back, and that's your middle manager, your frontline manager. So I'm glad you made that point.
Yeah. All right, we're almost to the top of the hour, so Connie, I'll just turn it over to you for a final thought here, and then I'll come back in and close things out.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to chat with you about this today. It is vitally important. We're now girding ourselves for another wave, and this is right as companies are doing their phase 1 deployment, so everything is fluid. I would welcome talking to you anonymously or being able to cite your organization in publications. I'm particularly interested in whatever companies are doing for customer safety, and I just encourage you to reach out to me if you have comments or questions. And I valued the time you gave us and appreciate it quite a lot.
Great. Thank you, Connie. And your contact information is right there on that page, that slide there. So folks, please be sure to reach out to Connie if you have further questions to answer that you'd like answered. I just want to say thank you to all of you for attending today and for your participation and questions. Be sure to tweet, follow us on Twitter. I've got a number of tweet handles in there: CMSWire, our Reworked handle, as well as the Deep Analysis handle, and as well as that for Skillsoft, our sponsor, who helped to make this happen today. So thank you. So we'll look forward to hearing your feedback on that. And then finally, if you stuck around, keep an eye on your inbox in the next few hours. We're going to be selecting a couple of folks who stayed for the Q&A, and we'll be sending you information on whether or not you won, or we'll be sending you information if you did indeed win one of those $50 Amazon gift cards. And then finally, I just want to say thank you. This webinar has been recorded, so you will, as a registrant to this, be receiving a link to the on-demand video in the next few business days once that's available. Thank you once again, Connie, for speaking today. Thank you to Skillsoft for making this possible. We definitely appreciate that support here. And if anybody's interested in supporting a webinar, be sure to get in touch at webinars@cmswire.com. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day, and we'll see you next time.